Plague Dogs is a little-known film that on the surface seems to be very similar to the cartoon adaptation of Watership Down. Both cartoons had more or less the same cast and crew, were both directed by Martin Rosen, both had Tony Guy as head of animation, and both were adaptations of books written by Richard Adams. However, where the Plague Dogs and Watership Down fundamentally differ is in their success. Watership Down was very popular in its day and still is quite well known now. The Plague Dogs, on the other hand, did not succeed anywhere near as much and is virtually unknown today. To understand this film better, let's look at its good, bad, and ugly. The story in of itself isn't particularly original. It's basically two characters escape from a lab or sort of prison-like lab and are basically just chased throughout the rest of the story. What is more original really is the way the story is told and the characters themselves. For starters, just like Watership Down, the characters are actually anthropomorphized animals. The story told from an animal's point of view, but that is a serious story, and it is quite a dark story too. It's not at all a Disney film. Another interesting thing when it comes to storytelling is that, unlike Watership Down, though it does focus more on human society. And one of the things it does, I think, that it does quite well is that even though we're told the story entirely from the point of view of the animals, we do get extracts, for instance, extracts from the news, or we hear two human characters talk, explain things from the human point of view. Building on that, another thing that is really good are just the characters themselves. I think another thing that leads to the strength of the characters in this cartoon is the fact that there are so few of them. In the Plague Dogs, there's only really two main characters that are really well developed. It's the two dogs that are on the run, Snitter and Rolf. And so the film really takes the time to explore them as characters and also their development and how they change throughout the story and throughout this very difficult time that they go through and how it affects them. Snitter is essentially this optimist who always believes that there's going to be something better that's going to come along, and he's the one who really pushes the two into action and to change their situation. Ruff, on the other hand, is much more practical, much more down to earth, so he can deal with the situation once he's there, and he can just fight through it. Whereas Snitter isn't quite as tough. So to see those two interact and balance off each other is very interesting, and it's done in a very believable way. It really does feel. I mean, you could just replace these two characters with the human people on the run, and it would have worked just as well. They have quite deep psychological aspects, and Snitter, his optimism really is counterbalanced with this guilt he has over the death of his master. He really thinks he is responsible for the death of his master. That comes through quite well during the film. He also goes progressively insane as their situation on the run gets harder and harder. There's less and less food, and they suffer more and more. He just oscillates between reality and fantasy and keeps on escaping into this magical world before the lab while he was still with his master. The way these two characters behave when they're put under a lot of pressure is very realistic and is something that is very true of how people behave. So I think it's a fascinating character study in that respect. And the other good character, the third one, really is Todd the Geordie Fox. He's this very wily, witty, well, he's a fox creature, and you visually you do sense. I mean, I suppose his storyline's a bit cheesier, really. I mean, he befriends them, and he simply just uses them for their strength because he thinks they might be useful to him. And then afterwards, as the story progresses, you do sense that he develops a genuine liking for these dogs, and he really appreciates the tragedy of their story. And again, the way that character was handled was very believable and very interesting. Now, another very good aspect of the cartoon is its animation. In that respect, you really can compare it to Watership Down because, well, for starters, they look very similar in their style, and that's no surprise because they basically had the same animation team. They certainly do an excellent job of capturing the mannerisms of the real animals, but all the while managing to portray for the animals expressions and their movements, emotions that human beings could understand. Problem, I think, with the animation, it just simply isn't as varied. When you compare it to Watership Down, is that for starters, it's a lot more colourful, it moves a lot more, and there's more surreal scenes. It just generally seems a bit more lively, even in the darker sections of the story. Just in the Plague Dogs, it is, well, generally grey. I think the colour grey is just overused all the time. There's not much light, and I think that can be off-putting if you're just looking at the film superficially. I mean, if you really take the time to get into the film, you can appreciate how great it is. It does convey the mood of the film. The film ultimately is this tragedy, and the story progresses essentially from autumn to winter, and you can see as nature is progressively dying, the dogs are becoming more and more depressed, and all those things work quite well. Speaking of animation, it's interesting to know that actually a 25-year-old Brad Bird was on the animation team for the Plague Dogs. Now, for those who don't know, Brad Bird is now a very well-known director and an extremely successful director. He directed Iron Giant, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, and most recent Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. So I think on the words Mission Impossible is a good way to segue into the bad. So yeah, in terms of the bad, there's not really anything I think there's particularly wrong with Plague Dogs, but it is most definitely an acquired taste, and that probably they should have. Well, mainly the biggest mistake would be in terms of how they presented the film. In the context of hand-drawn animation at the time, the way they presented the film was not a good indication of the content of the film. So what I mean by that is that basically if you look at the film's poster, you see two hand-drawn dogs being chased by a helicopter, and there's a magical adventure that's promised. And you read a bit about the story, and it's about these two talking dogs that escape from a lab. And it kind of sounds like that film, The Secret of NIMH, that your children liked. And it kind of seems like the thing you would want to watch with your family. Now that would be a huge mistake, because it's most definitely not a film for children. Even I think young teenagers might have trouble handling it. Depends how sensitive they are, but it is quite a tough film to watch. The general tone and pacing, I mean, it is. I think fundamentally I made this review because I think it's a great film and I think people should watch it. But if you do watch it, you have to be in the right mindset for it, and you have to be aware that this isn't an easy popcorn film. I mean, fundamentally, as I said, this is a tragedy. This is a depressing film. This is about two characters that escape torture and that are hunted throughout the film, that are pushed to their limits in terms of their physical conditions, in terms of their mental conditions. They end up completely depressed and half insane. And ultimately, the ending is very depressing, but can be poetic depending on how you look at it. I mean, if you want a good example of how to market a cartoon that's for grown-ups, just look at the Basky stuff. And that was obviously not for children, and it's clear just from the poster and from the summaries they put out who it was for. Another thing that I think, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it wasn't the wisest thing to do if you wanted your film to be well distributed, were the accents they chose for some of the characters. Now, the main characters are fairly mainstream British accents like my own, so I don't think it's too hard for non-British people to understand them. But otherwise, they choose local accents that are quite uncommon. You don't get much on TV, especially international television. And I suspect they would probably have been incomprehensible for anyone who isn't British, and even British people would struggle with some of the lines.
Just a proposition, Bonnie Larks. If you'll hunt and kill with me, I'll keep your reet and you'll get your meat. You'll run through the neat and follow me feet.
I don't understand a word he's saying.
I mean the ugly here in the most literal sense, as in they are quite simply ugly scenes that are just uncomfortable to sit through and just really unpleasant. I mean, especially in the opening sequences when they show, which is very important to film because it really shows their motivation as to what they're running from in the lab, the treatment they're being subjected to in the lab, and it really drives home the point that the film is trying to make about experimenting on animals, much better I think than The Secret of NIMH did. It's a very vivid portrayal, I think, of pretty much the torture animals endure in these experimental labs. Again, the opening sequence when they're in the lab and escaping from the lab, they're better sequences than anything I've seen in most horror films I've ever watched. I mean, they're that strong. I don't know if good is the right word, but they're certainly strong. I mean, this is something that you could easily just put in a Saw film. But having said all that, I think the violence is completely and utterly justified too, which is very rare to get that combination in a film of not only strong horror scenes that seem to be justified in terms of the story and in terms of the message a film is trying to drive. I mean, in this case, when you look at animal experimentation, also you could make exactly the same point about industrial farming, is that these things aren't made up. These things actually do happen. Animals really are treated that way. And just simply drawing it and making you sit through it, I certainly don't think is a bad thing. In fact, it's something that you should do if you claim you support either of those activities. Essentially, the film is a bit of hard to categorize. It's hard to fit it in one particular genre or subgenre. To have this cartoon that is not quite a horror film because the pace is too slow. It's slow psychological drama with horror elements, but also it ends on a hopeful note if you know how to look for it. So there's so many elements jumbling around in this film. It's very, very hard to quantify it. I'm really happy this cartoon exists. I'm really happy this cartoon was made, although I think it probably damaged a lot of careers on the way, except for Bad Birds, obviously. But it is a great. The Plague Dogs is a great piece of animation in its own right. It's also a great piece of storytelling in its own right. And I really think it shows that hand-drawn animation can tackle serious issues. Hand-drawn animation can make a serious grown-up film with real acting, real issues, real political issues, real character development, and real psychological issues. So I really wish that future animators can look at this film to see what can be done with hand-drawn animation. You don't always have to stick to the rules that Disney invented for money. But I can see why Plague Dogs did not enjoy commercial success. It is, again, I do admire it in the sense because it is so bold and so brave to make something that is so profoundly hard to market and so uncommercial. I really think this could have been at least a cult classic, but it doesn't even have that status right now. It's so unknown, which is a shame. So hopefully, maybe if you do listen to this review, if you like watching a very psychological drama with a bit of a horror feel to it, give Plague Dogs a go. Now, I know this isn't the most energetic or enthusiastic endorsement you can give for a cartoon, but Plague Dogs really is a very much a particular type of film that really is only for some people. So I don't want to just stick my neck out too much and guarantee you're going to like it. So, unlike Plague Dogs, I'm going to try and finish on a bit of a lighter note. So to sum Plague Dogs up in one sentence, it's a bit like the kind of thing that can surprise you in a Korean restaurant. The bittersweet dog's bollocks.